Hello everyone and welcome to CRTV 126B World Cinema 1945 to present. This is class 1 and this class is a little bit different than all the rest of the classes because we want to catch up and find out what was going on in motion picture history before 1945. If we were studying American history and we started somewhere around the 20th century, we would not have covered the Civil War or the Revolutionary War or the fact that we were a colony, the fact that we had slaves, all that kind of stuff. We'd be diving right in to the second part of American history and maybe assuming that everybody knew what happened before 1900. But I don't want to do that. I want to, it's a whole semester up to 1945 of world cinema. And so I want to do a little bit of catch up and sort of figure out where we've been up to this point and lay some terminology down, first person, third person, stuff like that, a little bit of the early history, not too much, but just enough so that if I'm referring back to something that I covered in the earlier class, that we're not lost or anything like that. We're all together. So this class, and don't worry, it's a lot of PowerPoint slides, but they're all with graphics. They're all illustrated, and I try to make it as visually attractive as I can. But after this, and this class, I have to say, again, this class is going to emulate as close as I can what I would be doing in the classroom. So this is actually more of sort of a distance education sort of a class rather than live. You're going to be self-paced, all that. We talked about that already. But this is as close as I can get to what we'd have in the classroom were this a regular type class. And normally I would be showing a couple of PowerPoint slides, and then I would have some clips from some films that I would be bringing in and showing you, probably a big old stack of DVDs and sometimes YouTube clips and things like that. Well, I can't bring in all of my DVDs and show you exactly what I'd like to show you, but YouTube is pretty darn good. I have to say, YouTube has a lot of the stuff that I would want to show, and sometimes a little bit different, and that's okay. And so the way I'd be doing it in class is a couple of PowerPoint slides, 5 or 10 or 15 minutes of a DVD, and back and forth. And so I recommend you take the class that way if you can. Do the class that way, I guess. You can stop this you can stop this video in the module and then skip ahead to the next module and then go back to this one again. I don't think it's too confusing. Otherwise, you're going to listen to me talk for an hour or maybe a little bit more, and then you're going to watch all of the clips that I was talking about in my lecture. And so I would recommend, if you can, go back and forth. But if not, that's okay. You'll still get all the same material. You would be taking notes off of the PowerPoint slides just like you would in a regular class, only instead of me talking maybe too fast and maybe moving on to the next PowerPoint slide a little faster than you'd prefer, you can always stop it anytime you want, take the PowerPoint slide notes down, and then listen to me talk for a little while. You can pause and take your own breaks and all of that. So this does make it, you are in control, so that's kind of cool. But that's the way I would be doing it in class. Of course, we'd be taking a break every hour and 20, 25 minutes, something like that. And you don't have to go for that long. You can take a break anytime you want. You can take a break every 20 minutes if you want. That is completely up to you. In the meantime, let's dive into our first official slide of our first official class here. And a little bit of an overview. This is good old Buster Keaton, one of the 3 classic silent geniuses, really. And we don't talk about him in this class, sorry. But I love that photo, and there he is on a tripod. And there are 3 parts to our class. and we're going to be going through them kind of back and forth. The technology is an important part. In the late 40s and early 50s, television is going to start playing a role. Widescreen movies are going to start playing a bigger and bigger role, and color is going to start creeping in bit by bit over the years. So there's the technology, and when we get to the end, we have a whole class on the history of computer-generated imagery, CGI. So we got to talk about that. And that's it. And sound is going to start playing a bigger and bigger role when we get into the 1970s with movies like Apocalypse Now and Star Wars. So all that technology, pretty important. And the business side, yes, very important. That is going to determine what movies they make. It is a business, and somebody needs to put together, in most cases, millions of dollars, borrow millions of dollars to put this idea on the screen. It's not quite like a book where you can sit there on your word processor and figure out what you want to do, or maybe even like painting or something like that. If you can, get your canvas and your paints and all that kind of stuff. This is a big deal. It is a big group project. Teamwork. The idea might come from a writer, it might come from a director, might even come from a studio or a producer, like Marvel stuff, and that is going to determine what we see in the screen. How much money can we borrow? My idea, it's a big movie, and oh my God, we've got to have spaceships or fast cars or exploding volcanoes. Okay, that's all going to cost money. And enough people have to believe in that you can raise the money, get it from banks, things like that, and make that movie. And that's why we see what we see in most cases. There are independent films, and we'll talk about independent films later on, movies like Pulp Fiction, things like that, that are sort of put together on the budget, and then studios check them out at film festivals and things like that. But for the most part, movies are a big budget deal, and we are going to see what the business thinks they can make money showing, right? If they think they can make money showing franchise movies like James Bond movies and Harry Potter movies and things like that, or if they think they can make money with smaller art films and that sort of thing. So that's the business side, and that's going to come through our class bit by bit here and there. The best part is the art. I love the art side of it, whether it's Buster Keaton from the Silent Days, or maybe somebody like Wes Anderson, or Ridley Scott, or somebody like that, or Steven Spielberg from the present. And so we're going to see or our class is going to jump back and forth from one part of these tripod legs to the other as we work our way through 1945 all the way up to the present. So let's dive in and start at the very beginning, where motion pictures came from. Edward Muybridge, yes, Edward is spelled correctly. Looks like Edward. And he took pictures of a horse in action to settle a bet. And the bet was, okay, yes, I did that on purpose. Does a horse at full gallop have all four of its hooves off the ground at the same time? And it's hard to tell. Horses move pretty fast. So he put a bunch of cameras along a track with a tripwire going across the track, and as the horse galloped, they would trip the cameras. So I don't know, 10 or 20 cameras, and they came up with this picture, and we see that yes, indeed, a horse does have all four of its hooves off the ground. There's actually a couple here at the same time, and whoever bet, I think Leland Stanford, that has his name for Stanford University, was one of the bettors. And so if you can imagine clipping these photos apart and flipping them, you get simulated motion. And so people took note of that and thought, well, if we can get pictures of all that stuff, then we're off and running. So who invented motion pictures? And the answer is three people, three groups of people actually, and that decade was the 1890s. Okay, so I don't have too many dates in this class, but that definitely is going to be one of them. Okay, when were motion pictures invented? And so the three parts. First off, George Eastman, and film up to the 1890s was done on linotype and tintype and big things like that, with giant cameras and so on. And if we think, do we have photos, we're talking photography now, not motion pictures, do we have photos of George Washington? And the answer is no, we don't have photos of George Washington. Do we have photos of Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president? Yes, we do, 1860. So somewhere between 1790 and 1860, photography was born, and that's just about exactly right. Right about 1830, early photography was developed, so to speak. And so there are photos of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. The exposure time was kind of long, so seeing people in action they couldn't do. But if you stood very still, or in the case of the Civil War, were dead, then they could take photos. So finally, in somewhere in the 1880s, celluloid from George Eastman came in. Celluloid, and you can spool it, and cameras could get smaller. And not very long after that, Thomas Edison asked Eastman, can you put about 100 feet or so of that, maybe it wasn't 100, maybe it's 50 feet or so of your celluloid on a big spool for me? And Edison set his team, a whole team of people together, and said, I want to do something where the film can go through the camera, and we'll take pictures that way. Lots of pictures, one right after the other, very fast. So it would be a hand-cranked camera, right? The camera operator would crank the film through the camera. I assume this is for panning and tilting here on the tripod. And so Edison and his team, W.K.L. Dixon, I believe his name was, don't worry about that, worked on the camera. And then when they had movies to show, they showed them what they called a peep show. So one person would put his eyes or her eyes up to the viewing and crank it, put a nickel in and crank it, and they could see a moving picture. And then the Lumiere brothers, they thought it would be nice to have movies with these moving pictures, right? Moving pictures, movies, projected in a theater. And the theater experience goes all the way back thousands of years, at least back to the Greeks, 2,500 years ago, probably a lot further back than that. And so that was a good move, right? Instead of watching movies individually, we watched them in groups, at least until home video and streaming and all of that. So those three, right? And by the about 1895, actually, right in the middle of the decade, we have motion pictures, moving pictures, available to be shown in theaters. So somewhere around 1907 and 1910, film production in the United States, which had been mostly in the New York, New Jersey area. Filmmakers would go across the river from New York to New Jersey. They had trees and wild, sort of a wild area, not city scape. and they could shoot in New Jersey, even if they wanted to do westerns and things like that. But the winters are pretty harsh back there, and so at some point, one of the movie entrepreneurs said, hey, take a camera or a couple of cameras and some of your actors and actresses and hop on the train. It would have been a train. Hop on the train and go out to California, sunny California. The real estate people tell us it's very nice, warm, and sunny, and 350 days a year of sunshine. So out they went to California first to visit. They would have stayed in apartments and things like that, rooming houses, and then eventually they would relocate and start buying property and things like that. Eventually putting up sets and so on. Westerns were very popular, so this is a good representative picture. So the move to California. 1914, 1920, we have the rise of the movie star, Charlie Chaplin, and he is probably one of the few people that everybody in this class recognizes. He's world famous, probably the most recognized person on the planet for a while, and fame is rather fleeting. There are a lot of big movie stars since then, big movie stars, every bit as big as Leo or Brad or Tom or anybody like that, or one of the four Chris's, Chris Pine, Chris Hemsworth, Chris Pratt, Chris Pine, Pratt, Hemsworth, Evans, right? One of the four Chris's. And we think they're big stars, they're in our big movies, but just like Humphrey Bogart or Greta Garbo or Clark Gable, who are the biggest stars of the era, their names have been lost for most people, and that's the way the Toms and the Chris's are going to be probably in 50 or 60 years. You have to be a pretty big star, like Chaplin, to be instantly recognized 70 or 80 or 100 years later. Marilyn Monroe might be another, maybe James Dean, but there aren't too many stars. Some of those other stars I talked about, like Clark Gable, he was the biggest male star in Hollywood, and most people today don't know who he was, and that's not on that you're ignorant. It's just the fleeting fame. Fame is very fleeting, and we lose track of that pretty fast. So movie stars, the studio system comes into being in the 1920s. It's kind of like a factory assembly line. We get mass production, right? We get mass production. It's a lot cheaper to make a bunch of stuff than to make just one. They call it economies of scale. Mostly they were Jewish immigrants from Poland and Russia and places like that. Mostly men that founded these studios. The money men were back in New York City, but the directors and the actors and the producers and everybody were out here in Southern California. The early Big Six studios, MGM, Paramount, Fox, Warner Brothers, RKO, and Universal. And they were the ones that were running things for the longest time. Those studios they made movies, they did production, they made the movies, and they distributed the movies. That means they made copies of them and sent them out. And then they owned the theaters. They owned the theaters, exhibition. And that's called vertical integration. And if you notice, it's in italics. That's kind of a key for you. Things that are in italics are going to be important and very likely be questions on tests and things like that. There's our good old Chinese theater up there in Hollywood. And they owned chains of theaters. Now, that was a sweet deal. Generally, the courts frown on that sort of thing. If you want to buy a truck, you're in Michigan, you can't just go to the Ford factory and knock on the door and say, hey, I understand you make Ford trucks here. I'd like to buy one, because they don't sell cars and trucks at the Ford factory. You have to go to a distributor. And it's a complicated deal, but that's generally the separation there, where they don't want vertical integration of much. And I know there are a few. There are Apple stores and Tesla shops and things like that, but generally the courts frown on vertical integration. So there's one of our business terms. I told you there was a little bit of business. It's one of our business terms, and if you're a business major taking this class, that's great. There are lots of jobs on the business side of motion pictures. You get to be a business major and all that, and then you get to work in the exciting entertainment industry. So if you're not a cinema studies major, but maybe possibly a business major, you still could think about working in the entertainment industry, Hollywood, TV, Netflix, Disney, all that stuff, right? There are plenty of job opportunities for business people too. So this studio system, they had long-term contracts for their actors and actresses and directors and writers too. It's rather paternalistic, right? The rude parent. And so actors get treated kind of like children, okay? It's a paternalistic system. Actors could be typecast, which means you are a cowboy, and that's what you do. You make cowboy movies, and or you are a singer and you make musicals. Judy Garland, somebody like that. And maybe you want to try something different, right? Maybe the cowboy wants to make a gangster movie or something like that, and the studio system says, no, you don't get to do that. Sorry, that's not your type. You are a horror star, Mr. Karloff, or you are a Western star, Mr. Wayne, or a musical star, Miss Garland. So typecasting, and a lot of actors are going to not be a big fan of that. They're going to think of themselves as artists and want to try new things, stretch, not just make the same thing that you're assigned to. 1927, sound era begins. There have almost always been sound in movie theaters. Sometimes full orchestras, large, maybe 50-piece orchestras would be in a big theater like the Chinese theater. Maybe just a piano player or an organist, but they weren't really silent. But in any event, we have sync sound with the lips moving and words coming out and synchronization. That first one would be the jazz singer. There's another date. There aren't too many dates, but that's a pretty good one. And so we're going to remember that one too. And it's the first talkie, the jazz singer. Very important movie. Kind of creaky by today's standards, but it was such an astounding technological breakthrough that it was a big, big hit. In the 1930s, 34 to be exact, and there's another date. Sorry, there's so many dates here, but this is kind of an important one. And we have the production code, sometimes called the Hays Code, referencing Will Hays, the head of that. And this was done by the studios. It's not the government, not churches, not municipalities, nothing like that. It was all done by the studios themselves. They could see the writing on the wall. There were people writing letters and protesting and forming groups and things like that, and they knew that if they didn't get a handle on it, then it would be imposed on them. So they put their own code in. Now this is what they call pre-code, right? This is part of the reason why they did that. This is the pre-code. You notice Jane there, Marino Sullivan, and Johnny Weissmuller as Tarzan, and pretty skimpy stuff. And after the production code starts being enforced, It had been around for a while, but it wasn't really enforced very well, sort of like the speed limit, I guess. Then her costume got to be almost like a dress, and his also, right? So not just live action romantic type movies, and the studios in the 20s, they were kind of pushing the envelope. They really were. Movies about divorce and things like that, and a lot of people just weren't real happy with that sort of thing. They didn't really show a whole lot, but if the boss and the secretary were alone together, and then they go into a room and close the door, then most people could figure out what was going on. And it was just that sort of implication that people found objectionable. So subject matter, little bits of nudity, some nudity, yeah, definitely some nudity. Violence, right? There were a lot of gangster movies in 1931 and 1932, a lot of gangster movies. I think like 50 or 60, I can't remember the figure, 50 or 60, I think, gangster movies. And so very loud, lots of Tommy guns, Thompson submachine guns, lots of Tommy guns, and all that. So sex, violence, nudity, language, situations, all of that. 1939, we have Hollywood's greatest year. Here are two that you probably know, and then there are a bunch of movies that you probably don't know, like Gunga Din and Ninotchka, and movies like that. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Stagecoach. Okay, some pretty good movies, but these are the two that are pretty famous that everybody seems to know about. Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. Gone with the Wind has made more money once we adjust for inflation. Okay, the dollar doesn't buy what it used to buy. And well, I'll talk about, I have a slide on adjusting for inflation, but once we adjust for inflation, Gone with the Wind comes out on top of Avengers and Titanic and Avatar and all of that. Wizard of Oz wasn't really much of a hit movie. It became kind of a beloved classic thanks to television. Thanks to television. It was, you know, people liked the movie when it came out, but it wasn't much of a hit. It came out as a response to all the money that Disney made off of Snow White. And Snow White was a huge hit. So MGM thought that they would try their luck at a sort of a family children's movie, and it didn't do very well at all, but it got bought by television people, television networks, and it was shown every year around Christmas time for 20 years or so, and it became a favorite classic. So thanks to television, a lot of movies we sort of know about because of television. So two great movies, wonderful movies, Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz. So what makes a great movie? Well, it's the same sort of question we might ask about other arts. And sometimes I like to talk about the Olympics when we have skaters, gymnasts, snowboarders, divers. There's no tape measure or stopwatch for them. There are judges, as you probably know. There are judges. And so the judges are kind of representing a general agreement of experts for movies. And we could be talking about literature. We could be talking about Faulkner or Hemingway or Fitzgerald, somebody like that. We could be talking about painting, Rembrandt or Picasso. We could be talking about music with Beethoven, theater with Shakespeare. Okay, they're all generally agreed upon to be works of art. And so I'm going to condense that to consensus. And so we have a general consensus that such and such is a great movie, a great book, a great play, a work of art. But that brings up another question, because there are some things in Gone with the Wind which is set in the Civil War. Okay, it's set during the Civil War, and the way that blacks are treated in that movie, they don't resonate particularly well. Now, there's lots of old movies that aren't fully woke, as we might say. But you know, that's going to hurt the way people think of a movie. Now, all old movies aren't bad. When we see something like Casablanca, it's held up really quite well. And there are lots of old movies that have held up very well, including Citizen Kane, held up very well. But over the years, Gone with the Wind has lost some of its luster. So we need, does it stand the test of time? This, by the way, is from Citizen Kane here, the Kane, and there's Xanadu, his castle. So does it stand the test of time? And so really great movies, just like Rembrandt, just like Shakespeare, and so on, stand the test of time, and we're going to shorten that to perspective. Perspective, nice way to condense all that. So consensus and perspective, there they are in italics. That should help you out. Very likely going to be needing to know those words at some point when we have a test, something like that. Okay, and you might check out a little bit of Citizen Kane if you get a chance. There are lots of good clips and things on YouTube of Citizen Kane. I don't usually have time to show it in class, but it is quite a movie, and you might want to check it out. Okay, so part of what makes Citizen Kane as great as it is, the greatest film of all time, according to consensus and perspective. Okay, and it doesn't top every poll. It tops most polls. It tops most. I think if we were to take an aggregate, it would come in first. There are other great movies that are usually in those lists. 2001 and The Graduate, Lawrence of Arabia, wonderful movies like that. Part of it is this wonderful cinematography, what they call deep focus. Here we have very close to the camera, a little further back, and then way, way back, and it's all in focus. So that's part of what made Citizen Kane a great movie, was its cinematography. There's also wonderful makeup, editing. The script is nonlinear. There are story. It sort of tells his story through 6 different viewpoints, so it jumps back and forth in time, which is pretty unusual for 1941. So anyway, a lot of great stuff in Citizen Kane. And that's a why, right? Experts are going to see that stuff. Experts are going to see, oh wow, look at that cinematography, look at that lighting, and so on. And the casual viewer might not pick up on some of that stuff. I know I've learned about Citizen Kane over the years. There's a commentary track. Unfortunately, it's not the director's commentary track from Orson Welles. That's Orson Welles right there. He was 25. There he is in older aged makeup. But he did not do a director commentary track. But Roger Ebert, the film critic, did, and I learned a lot from it, right? There's a lot that experts can see in something, just like experts might see Shaun White on the snowboard. As far as I can tell, you know, if a snowboarder or a skater or a gymnast jumps and twists and turns and twirls and lands, and they don't land on their butt, then it looks pretty good to me. And the next person might go up and skate or jump or leap and land and not fall on their butt, and it looks pretty good. But experts are going to see all these minute little details in figure skating and gymnastics and diving and all that sort of thing. The rest of us aren't going to see. All right, a little bit more technology here. Color. That should be in your syllabus. I get asked from students, when did movies have color? And sort of the short answer is movies have almost always been in color. If you want to look up this film, it's called A Trip to the Moon by Georges Méliès, and it's only 12 minutes long, and it's right there on YouTube, easy to find. I think it's even on Netflix. At least it was for a while. So it's hand colored, frame by frame, and a 35 millimeter frame is only about 2.5 inches or so. It's only about 2.5 inches. So take this whole picture, squeeze it down to 2.5 inches, and you have a pretty small area right there that would have to be colored in frame by frame. Back then, they were about 16, 18 frames per second. By the time sound came in, they landed on 24 frames per second. Now, the vast majority of movies use digital cameras, but there's sort of an equivalency of frames per second. So anyway, early stuff, but colored hand by hand, and that movie's only 12 minutes long, so that was not going to be the main way movies would be in color. Then, in the 1920s, we get a bath process where an entire scene might be one color. Night is often blue. Deserts would often be tinted yellow. Jungles would be green. Sometimes sepia. Sepia? I'm not sure. I asked my art students, is sepia or sepia? It's sort of golden brown, sort of a color, and then just regular grayscale stuff. So in the 1920s, there was lots of color in the movies, just not multiple colors. In the later 20s, we do get two-strip color process. Douglas Fairbanks, the Black Pirate, I believe, from the 1920s, 27 or 28 or so. It's a two-strip process, not quite all the way there. I think it's red and blue, but not green, something like that. But you really need more to do that for a realistic color process. And then in the early 1930s, we get Technicolor, which is realistic three-strip color process. So that's pretty much when we get a good color. Pretty much when we get a good color, 1930s. 1930s. I would ask a decade, not a year. This is 1939's Gone with the Wind there. Beautiful stuff. A lot of animation. Walt Disney really jumped on color and used it for all of his animated films. Snow White, all that. Worked pretty well for animation. Kind of unwieldy. Check out the cameras. Okay, that's a monster. That's a monster camera for sure. Okay, and there are 3 strips of film in there, right? 3 strips of Technicolor film in there. So, and then they had to be layered and processed, and it was really a big hassle. It's really a big hassle. And moviegoers like us, we vote with our pocketbooks. How many, I ask my students when I can get a show of hands, how many have seen a 3D movie lately? And only maybe 1 or 0 hands go up. We are voting, basically, that we don't really care. We don't really care if it's 3D or not. And a lot of moviegoers back in the 30s voted, it doesn't really matter if it's in color or not. Now, they voted very heavily for sound. So people almost completely quit going to see silent movies, almost quit entirely seeing silent movies within about 3 years. Okay, 3 years it took sound to come in. Virtually 100% of movies were sync sound in about 3 years. But with color, it took about 30 years. About 30 years, right? There were plenty of black and white movies. Maybe only half of the movies were in color by 20 years later, by the 1950s. And it's not till we get in deep into the 60s before we get virtually all all color films. Now there are specialty films. Directors will do a black and white film. Tim Burton did Frankenweenie in black and white. So you have this as your handout, so don't worry about writing this all down. But we see that it took a while, right? 68 took a while before films were in color, from somewhere around in here. Technicolor, actually I think it's 32, not 35. But anyway, 1930s, pretty good color, and it's not till we get to the 60s before virtually all movies are in color. A couple more terms that we're going to need to know before we get into our class proper. Double features. It used to be A movies, and the second movie on a double feature would be the B movie. But often, the A movie would have bigger stars and bigger budgets. So simply the movie that played first became the A movie in theatrical terms, and the second movie became the B movie. Now there are plenty of great B movies, including this one, Gun Crazy, great film noir, but they didn't have the big stars and they didn't have the big budgets and all that. So kind of hidden gems, really, a lot of hidden gems for those movies. So A movies and B movies. And B movies in the 1950s sort of transition to become drive-in movies. And we get like Castle of Blood and movies like that. Movie studios sort of dumping their product into drive-ins over the summer. And then when we get into the 1960s, when we talk about Easy Rider, and Easy Rider was a drive-in movie, and it was much more important than that. It's sort of a derogatory term. It's just a drive-in movie, not a big deal. It's just a drive-in movie. Okay, a couple more general terms for us. Auteur. There's the auteur theory from the French. Some directors exert a personal style, control, and vision. Here we have auteur Quentin Tarantino. There were plenty going back to the musical days, Busby Berkeley, and on through John Ford with his westerns, and Alfred Hitchcock with his suspense films. And mostly back then, the studios had decided the main look of a movie, the style, the aesthetics of the movie. But a few directors managed to sort of rise above that, and some French critics took note and started talking about auteurs, which is just the French word for author, by the way. So auteur theory, and this class is mostly concerning auteurs, and we'll talk about plenty, including Steven Spielberg and Quentin Tarantino and the Coen brothers and so on. Okay, it's a term from English class. Third person, by far the most common narrative device. It's sort of like the camera is telling the story. Okay, she, they, he, so on. If you remember your English class. But there's first person, and first person is very interesting, and we are going to see and concentrate on a lot of movies that are really told in the first person, whether it's Double Indemnity or Sunset Boulevard or Clockwork Orange or Fight Club. There are some good, amazing first-person movies. And so in books, of course, we would write I, me, mine, but in movies, that is mostly done with voiceover, right? And importantly, we hear their thoughts. We hear their thoughts, and that lets us get inside the protagonist's head. So that's a very important thing there. Really, really good. Now, the downside is that if the protagonist doesn't know something, then neither do we in the audience. Okay, so they would be surprised and we would be surprised. Hitchcock liked the third person because he liked to show, here are these people in this room and there's a bomb that they don't know about. And he says that's how you build suspense. We, the audience, know that there's a problem, a device, somebody's hiding behind the door, there's a bomb in the closet, something like that. and the characters in the movie don't. And so that's how you build suspense. So that's great. That's cool. Hitchcock, he's a master. But first person is also interesting because we can hear their thoughts. We get into their heads, and that's also very important. Okay, and we have to watch out for the unreliable narrator. Now, Forrest Gump, they're going to play that for laughs, but he's kind of unreliable. We're going to be in on the joke. He's going to talk about his friend bought him some stock in a fruit company, and that fruit company was Apple. Okay, so we're going to be in on the joke. He's going to get... Okay, so I know that was a long class. We had a lot to cover, 50, 60 years of history in there. And like I said, the rest of the classes, they won't be quite that long, and they certainly will have more film clips and videos and scenes and all that kind of stuff interspersed, at least I hope interspersed throughout the class. So thank you so much. There I am in my home office, although I've spent some time pulling down wallpaper and all that. It doesn't quite look like that anymore. The wallpaper's down and the popcorn's off the ceiling and everything's been changed, but I'll have an updated picture of me at work and in the near future. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining me with class number 1, CRTV 126B, World Cinema, 1945 to present. And until next class, take care.